Pleasure to introduce presenter Anthony Sammarco, who is a noted historian and the author of 85 books. Wow. There will be an opportunity to get an autographed book at the end of this presentation right here. And I just want to say, in case you're all wondering how a gentleman with such an Italian name touches on Irish heritage, his grandmother is indeed Irish. So now that we got that straightened out.
Thank you so much.
No, it is funny. I basically always think in some ways, I do have a very ethnic name, but my grandmother was Mary Madden, and basically she married a Mitchell of Boston. So I thought in some ways, when I do these lectures, I try to include not only people that we know, but people in our families that we basically assume in some ways not only came to the New World for a specific reason. It could have been famine, as in Ireland. It could have been basically the social upheavals of the 1840s in Germany, or it could have simply been religious or political reasons. Well, Boston in the 19th century would change tremendously, and this lecture pertains primarily to the Irish, but it really could be any ethnic immigrant group. Boston in the period, as we see here in a painting from 1801, it's in the collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society, gives us a good idea of what basically Boston looked like in the very early part of the 19th century. The old State House, which had been the seat of provincial government, had actually become the new Commonwealth of Massachusetts State House. And in that instance, this was a major feature of Boston, and we realized that Boston was changing. Boston's population was about 18,000 people. And the street, which we call State Street, originally King Street because King George III was the king of the colonies, would actually have the south end on the left-hand side and the north end on the right-hand side. Boston was changing from a town built of wood into a town built of what is today brick. And that was because of Charles Bulfinch. Bulfinch was educated at Harvard College. He graduated in 1786. He took the grand tour of Europe, and 3 years later he returned to Boston and began to introduce neoclassical architecture. And in that instance, he not only created the red brick row houses of Boston, but he transformed Beacon Hill into a residential neighborhood. In many ways, Boston was a place that's seen here in a map of 1814 that was a peninsula of 800 acres. When it was settled by the Puritans in 1630, this actually had a neck seen in the lower center, which was actually a place that connected Boston with Roxbury, and it was the only means by land to arrive in Boston. This map began to show how Boston was becoming a place that would eventually, in 1822, embrace a municipal government, becoming the city of Boston. Well, during this period of time, Boston's population was increasing through matriculation. But we realized by the period of the 1810, Boston actually had Irish and French Roman Catholics. Well, the French had come because of the French Revolution of 1793, but there were Irish in Boston prior to the 1840s, and a place of worship was built on, as what we see here, on what is today Franklin Street, then Franklin Place. This was designed by Charles Bulfinch, the architect I just mentioned. This was something, when it was opened in 1804, that could seat 400 people, probably twice the amount of space they really needed. But it was within a very wealthy neighborhood. On the left-hand side can be seen the spire of the Federal Street Church. When it moved to the Back Bay, it became the Arlington Street Church. It was Unitarian. But on the right, you can see an edge of the Tontine Crescent, probably the most expensive area in Boston at the turn of the 19th century. But in some ways, people began to realize that by the 1840s, immigration to Boston was basically because of a potato famine. For 3 consecutive years, the potato famine would see potatoes simply rot. And because they were the diet of most of the Irish, we began to realize that the only aspect of survival was either to immigrate, and of course over 1 million people would immigrate, 1 million would die, and 1 million remained. Well, in the 1840s, this print, done by Currier and Ives, shows a typical man from Ireland, not only with a corncob pipe and a hat. He was the typical person living in a farm with, of course, a thatched roof cottage. Well, during that period, these cottages themselves were built not only of brick, we would also see them of stone, but we'd also see them built of mud cakes. They had a thatched roof, and this is a family, ironically, from 1890 in a photograph. The family is in the foreground, but if you notice on the left-hand side, there's an open area with no roof. Because in the 19th century, many people farmed the land, they would raise not only crops for themselves to sustain themselves, but they'd also raise crops to sell for taxes. And of course, any building that didn't have a roof was not taxed as a residence. It would be used to house animals, not only cows and sheep, but even horses. And this was basically the hardscrabble life that many people were entailing. And of course, with an aspect of not only famine, seen here in a print of the 1850s, we realize that many people were evicted from their homes, simply for the fact they could not pay their taxes. Not only could they not pay their taxes, but they couldn't feed their families. The priest would actually console the family, but what could one do? Well, in that period, if they could raise enough money, they might immigrate to the United States. Some British landlords would actually allow them not only a little bit of money, but enough to actually allow them to come to the New World. And in that way, there was a chance of survival. Well, in some ways, when we realize it, Boston took the forefront in this aspect of trying to alleviate poverty and famine. This is Robert Bennett Forbes. He lived on Pemberton Square on Beacon Hill, but he also had a house on Milton Hill, which is today the Robert Bennett Forbes House Museum. He himself was a man who would raise money and supplies to take to Ireland to help alleviate the starvation. And in that instance, we realize that he clipped a ship called the Jamestown. And this wonderful print shows that on March 28th of 1847, this depicts the departure of the Jamestown for Cork, Ireland. Of course, Robert Bennett Forbes had made his name to fame and fortune through the China trade. It wasn't the fact that he brought back Nanking and Canton and beautiful silks and spices, it was through the opium trade. But in this way, he arrived at Cork with quite a bit of money, almost $1 million. But he also brought a ship laden with food. And in that way, he was somebody who could actually try to alleviate the plight of people. When the ship returned to Boston, it was filled with over 400 immigrants that he himself actually would bring to the New World. And seen here, many people being evicted from their farms have really no alternative. Maybe the aspect of living in the New World was something that would provide them with not only a new source of life, but maybe a new purpose. And during that period, roughly from 1847 right through to the time of the Civil War, Boston would change dramatically. And seen here again in another Currier and Ives print, it shows Outward Bound. The man, typical of any one of us, or any immigrant group looking for a new start in life, looks at a placard on the wall, and it says it's the Shamrock line, the American packets. This would take one from Ireland to New York, but there were many other packets that would actually provide transportation. It sounds ridiculous, but it was less than $5 at that time, which today would probably be the equivalent of about $1,000, which was almost beyond the capabilities of most people. But the whole idea was there would also be the whaling. And seen here at a railroad station, the man in the very center, surrounded by two women, obviously his mother and his sister, bid farewell to him. But look at the women in the background, their arms raised. They knew they would probably never come back to Ireland. And in that way, the send-off was something by train to eventually arrive at either Cork or to go into England and depart from Liverpool would mean that they would be taking a clipper ship. Today, we know the Cunard line still survives. They did provide clipper ships to bring many immigrants to the New World. The White Star line, but this is the train line. And Enoch Train was probably one of the wealthiest business merchants in Boston, who would actually have upwards of a dozen clipper ships built by Donald McKay at his East Boston shipyard, and of course there was always a T on the foresail. In this instance, Train himself, in direct competition with Cunard Line, was said that between the period of 1850 and 1865, was said to have brought over 25,000 people in his ships. And it was important because he financed Donald Mackay. His name may not be familiar, but this man, born in Canada, who started his business in Newburyport, was encouraged by Train to come and open his shipyards on Water Street at the foot of Eagle Hill in East Boston. And there, from the period of roughly the 1845 to 1871, when he retired, he would build ships, not just for Train, but many others. And these clipper ships became bigger and bolder, and many of his ships would traverse the globe in 79 days. Well, many times we realize Enoch Train was somebody who was really quite a philanthropist. He was actually raised in poverty, but by the period of his 20s as a counting clerk at a merchant store in Boston, he would eventually save enough money to actually start investing in trade. His import-export business was fantastic, and it allowed him to build a clipper ship. By the period of 1871, as I mentioned, he had a dozen ships and was probably one of Boston's first multimillionaires. But as seen here, his company became known as Train and Company. We have a packet which actually traversed the Atlantic Ocean from Liverpool to Boston. And you see that in this instance, not only did they offer superior accommodations for passengers, which would be cabin class, but they also provided at least 2/3 of the space for immigrants. The ships were the Star of the Empire, Chariot of Fame, Staffordshire, Daniel Webster, Parliament, North America, President, and the Western Star. These were important aspects because coming to the New World, they did bring freight, but it was human cargo. When they returned to Europe, they usually brought things that could be traded, and as a result, Train became increasingly wealthy. And seen here in a wonderful painting, this is something that's off the coast of Liverpool, and it shows the train line with its red flag and diamond, white diamond star, is something in some ways that people would realize this was life and life hope. In a lot of ways, Boston was changing in this period, and between roughly the 1850s and 1860s, Boston itself would see so many new immigrants that by the period of 1860, with a population of 250,000, Boston was composed of at least 1/2 Irish immigrants and Irish first generation. And in this way, seen here, again, it says the Irish immigrants, and this is a recent print that was done, shows them on the poop deck, which would be the third class or steerage area of the ship. This was something that was important. They had all of their earthly possessions in front of them, and of course these were trips that took anywhere from 10 to 12 weeks. Many people in this instance would look at these ships as almost coffin ships. People were crammed cheek by jowl, and yes, many people did die or contract illnesses that they would eventually go to the Deer Island Hospital. But the aspect here is that we realize that the aspect was that the poop deck itself, as they began to arrive in Boston, was one of the major features. And seen here with hundreds, if not thousands of people crammed on the poop deck, the foredeck, as well as in the cabins themselves, was something that was bringing new life to Boston. In this period of time, many people realized, and this is the emigrants' arrival at Constitution Wharf, that hundreds of people would come to greet not only family but friends. This is a print from the period of 1848. The USS Constitution had been built at Constitution Wharf by Jack Hart. And in this way, we realize that was the embarkation as well as arrival port for the entire city. Look at the people. The man in the center actually has basically a top hat, cane. Obviously his mother beside him with a headscarf and shawl. And we realize that their family, seen on the far right, who have become Bostonians, represent in instances people that are upwardly mobile. So the whole concept was that the old world was meeting the new world, and Boston was changing. It wasn't easy though. In some ways, most of the Irish themselves would arrive and depart in some ways from an area called the North End. Within a generation, many did move to different places. But between the 1840s and the 1860s, Places such as Half Moon Street, where the royal governor Thomas Hutchinson's mansion had once been located in the 18th century, was now composed of what were individual houses that were subdivided. They weren't apartments, they were rooms, and entire families would live in one room each. It was squalor. It provided, in some instances, little privacy, and there was also cholera as well as typhus. Many people looked at the North End as a great example in some ways of maybe a place of employment. Many people coming to Boston came from an agrarian culture. Boston was an urban center. It was developing as a major seaport. Many of these men seen here were coopers. They made barrels. And we realized that also fisheries. These were things that allowed many of the immigrants, some of which of course spoke English but were illiterate, would actually find a place of employment. These photographs in some ways depict people 150 years ago seeking a new life in a totally new environment. And in that way, they may not only be a cooper or a fisherman, many of the women became domestic servants, especially in the Beacon Hill and Back Bay townhouses of the well-to-do Boston Brahmins. This photograph, which again probably dates to the 1890s, shows two women working in the kitchen, probably the cook on the left and the scullery maid on the right, and we realized that this was something that not only provided a roof over one's head, but a small stipend on a monthly basis. These were important features. This was a step up in the new world, and it was something that many people realized they could actually have. But in that period of the 1850s and 1860s, so many new immigrants were coming to Boston that there was an aspect of rising against the immigrants. This is a flag of the Know Nothing Party that actually was something that right in the 1850s and 1860s actually would elect a governor of Massachusetts. It said, "Native Americans, beware of foreign influence." Well, foreign influence was something that not only brought Roman Catholics, Irish from the agrarian culture, but also people who would do anything to support their families. So they were a threat on all bases. During that period of time, the Know Nothing Party would eventually elect George Gardner. He was the governor of Massachusetts. He lived in Dorchester, Massachusetts, and he was somebody in some ways that would oversee a political party that rivaled that of the Democrats and Republicans. The Know Nothing Party, however, was something that when people were found to actually have done destruction, to give you an example, there was a church in Dorchester known as St. Gregory's Roman Catholic Church. It's the oldest Roman Catholic church in Dorchester. The Know Nothing bombed it, and as a result, the church was totally destroyed. And though people knew who did it, they would say, "I know nothing." And in that instance, the Know Nothing Party was something that actually contrived in some ways that native-born Americans, in that instance, were threatened by the immigrants. Of course, many people realized that the aspect here was that broadsides would be posted throughout Massachusetts, and it says, "Natives of the soil, arouse. Shall American labor be protected against foreign competition in the home labor market?" Well, the watchword of Native Americans, it says, "Report the influx of foreign influence by repelling the influx of foreign immigrants. Protect against foreign competition, as well as the labor market, and the limitations of area of slavery and of the fugitive slave law." In this instance, people ran in the competition for not just local government, such as the House of Representatives or the Senate, but even the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. Many people felt in some ways that these things would say the ruinous influence of foreign immigration on American labor was paramount in most people's minds. Now granted, we were always going to have different aspects in society. It was a socioeconomic aspect. But many people who were working class were threatened because of the Irish and other immigrants. And in that instance, we realized cartoons would become quite popular. Sorry, I'm doing two things. But these cartoons that were done in the 1860s and 1870s began to depict the immigrants as not only ignorant, but people that in some instances had facial deformities. And seen here, of course, everyone knows that Irishmen drink whiskey, but this isn't a dram of whiskey, this is a glass of whiskey. Well, not only with their hats, their protruding noses, and of course the lack of teeth, we realize Boston was beginning in some ways in this ignorant stage, especially with the Know-Nothing Party, as creating something that was really quite different. Okay. And this broadside would said, Americans to the rescue, Irishmen under arms. It says Americans, sons of the Revolution, a body of 75 Irishmen known as the Columbia Artillery, had volunteered their services, get this, to shoot down the citizens of Boston, aided by a company of United States Marines, nearly all of whom are Irishmen, and now under arms to defend Virginia in kidnapping a citizen of Massachusetts. American, these Irishmen have called on us, cowards and sons of cowards. Shall we submit to have our citizens shot down by a set of vagabond Irishmen? Well, the Columbian Artillery was truly an Irish group, and they drilled in Boston in the 1850s and 60s, but they weren't against Bostonians. They actually served with honor during the Civil War, and they actually were a totally Irish Roman Catholic artillery. Many people in this instance, but the idea was that even newspapers during this period of time were actually having all sorts of different placards that were placed, and it said, wanted, a good, reliable woman to take care of a boy 2 years old in a small family in Brookline. Good wages and a permanent situation given. No washing or ironing will be required, but good recommendations as to character and capacity demanded. Positively no Irish need apply. And in that instance, it was simply for the fact of not only being Roman Catholic, but immigrants, because of this horrid ignorance, people began to realize that, well anyway, it says, help wanted, no Irish need apply. Well, seeing here, Boston from the hot air balloon was something that would actually be Boston in the period of 1865. As I mentioned earlier, Boston had a population of 250,000 people, of which 1/2 were immigrants or the children of immigrants. Seen here, we're looking at the area of downtown Boston. Looking at the left midpoint, we see the spire of the Old South Meeting House. And if we carry it down on a 45-degree angle, we come to the crenellated tower of Trinity Church. This area would be completely destroyed in 1872 by the Great Boston Fire of 1872. But the whole aspect was that Boston itself had now become a city that was actually divided between Native Americans and immigrants. By this time, in some instances, it wasn't just the Irish, but it was even the Germans. As early as 1848, Germans were coming to Boston. The social upheavals in Germany would bring many middle-class and well-educated people. This is something in some ways that looks like a political campaign poster. On the left, we have an Irishman with his shillelagh, and it says Irish whiskey, so he has a barrel. The man on the right is German, and he has lager beer. Don't forget, the Stony Brook in Roxbury had 21 German beer breweries in the 19th century. But look at what they hold between them, the ballot box. Now remember, as early as the late 1840s, we began to see Irish and German, followed by a plethora of other immigrant groups coming to Boston. Many people did become American citizens, but their children who were born in Boston had the automatic vote if they were male. Sorry, women. But in that instance, the vote was something that you could cast for somebody that might actually share your same interest or background. And in this way, the ballot box began to change Boston. In some ways, there was still ignorance. There was still ignorance, and it says, our new citizens, and this is Officer O'Rourke. Look at the face. He looks like a chimpanzee, whiskers, and he's the policeman. And of course, he's somebody in some ways that's typical, because the Boston Police Department, as well as the Boston Fire Department, became almost 80% Irish or Irish descent by the early 20th century. And in that instance, it wasn't just the aspect of jobs, but it was also for the fact, there we are. It was not only the aspect of Boston changing, but it was also new institutions that were changing the face of Boston. Many new places of worship were being built, and this, the Church of the Immaculate Conception, designed by Patrick Keeley, one of the foremost Catholic architects in North America, was built in the South End. Now, the South End was created from the infilling of the neck, and in that instance, it created an entirely new Victorian neighborhood, which was middle and upper middle class. Unfortunately, by 1873, the South End had embraced in some ways a totally new aspect. The panic of 1873 caused many of these buildings, constructed in speculative manners, to be sold for whatever they could bring. And the South End would eventually become, for over a century, a neighborhood of immigrants. The Roman Catholic Church here, though, great example of a beautiful structure built of sandstone. And in that way, Keeley himself not only designed it as a magnificent church, but it could seat over 1,100 people. And it was said at the turn of the 20th century that there were 7 masses every Sunday. But they also had, in some ways, a place directly beside it. I'm almost tempted to throw this thing at the wall. There. And this was actually directly beside the Church of the Immaculate Conception, and this was Boston College. In the 19th century, of course, Harvard University, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and a plethora of other higher places of learning were in Boston. But the Jesuits began a place for the young men, the sons and grandsons of the Irish immigrants, to be educated. And Boston College, which was in the South End right up until the time of the first decade of the 20th century, when it moved to Chestnut Hill, is a great example of a building that was used for higher learning. When they moved to Chestnut Hill, this became known as Boston College High School. So in that way, we're beginning to see the sons and grandsons of the immigrants becoming well educated. And the aspect is, it really did change Boston. So it wasn't just places of worship, places of education, but it was even the Carney Hospital. Andrew Carney, who had been born in Ireland in 1813, had come to Boston in the 1840s. Again, he was a man who was affected by the famine. He started up a business with a man named Jacob Sleeper, and their company, Sleeper and Carney, was a tailoring firm, and they provided ready-made gentlemen's suits. He did extremely well. Not only did he found the Hibernia Savings Bank, but he would also, in this instance, give a large sum of money for the creation of Carney Hospital. Well, this was on Telegraph Hill in South Boston, where it would remain until 1957, when it moved to Dorchester near Lower Mills. Carney was somebody who, though, when he endowed this, said that though he was an Irish immigrant, and obviously experienced all sorts of degradation, was somebody that said that this hospital was to provide medical care for people without aspect of creed, color, or nationality. And in that way we realized that he was somebody who really did change Boston. Well, there was also, well, you're going to be dizzy by the end of the time. There was also the House of the Angel Gabriel, as well as the St. Vincent's Orphan Asylum. But seen here in the area of Tremont Street at Mission Hill, this was something where young women would be sent if they were wayward. The building is now actually called Harvard Co-ops at Roxbury. But during the 19th century, this was something in a lot of ways that would see many institutions providing not just orphanages, places of residence, as well as we see here, a place as a home of reformation. But the whole aspect was, they would eventually sell the original church that was on Franklin. So the aspect was that in 1875, they built the Cathedral of the Holy Cross. This building, built at the corner of what is today Washington Street and Melrose Street, was also designed by Patrick Keeley. Now, Keeley was a man who was born in Canada, of Irish descent. When he came to Boston, he not only designed 40 churches in Boston and the surrounding areas, but he was said to have designed over 200 churches in and around New England and Canada. Well, this was a church that was meant to show that the Irish had arrived. It was projected in some ways that the two spires would actually be for the lower chapel and the upper chapel. The upper chapel tower was 222 feet, if it would ever be completed. But because the church was built of Roxbury pudding stone, it was something in some ways that the weight of the filled land was so great that the towers could never be completed. But these churches, in some ways, immaculate, as well as, of course, others throughout Boston, would actually seat thousands of people. And the cathedral, which has just undergone a tremendous restoration, is a great example of the ascendancy of the Irish. In that instance, it was something, and we realized that during that period, it wasn't just religion, but it was also the fact, because of that ballot box, we realize now that people had the vote. The first mayor who was not native born to be elected the mayor of Boston was Hugh O'Brien. Granted, he was 5 years of age when his family came from Ireland, but he was somebody who was a ward boss in Boston. And in 1880, he received the Democratic ticket, not only nomination, but he was actually elected as mayor of Boston. And in that instance, many people, the Boston Brahmins especially, realized that the vote was something that was really going to transform the entire city. During this period, roughly from 1880 to the 1940s, Boston would be dominated in some ways by many of the Irish and their descendants. And seen here is Honey Fitz. John Fitzgerald, a man who was actually the son of Irish immigrants, was a little bit of a cut above. He was actually being educated at the Harvard Medical School when his parents died, and he dropped out of school to take care of his younger brothers and sisters. In that instance, one of the jobs that was available to him was to be a political ward boss. And because they lived in the North End, which was primarily Irish until about 1905, when it became Italian-American, he was somebody in many ways that realized that working in politics was something that not only was effective, but it was quite lucrative. In this instance, he was somebody who would run for the mayor. And seen here in a photograph, this is 1906, for mayor, John F. Fitzgerald. Primaries, November 16th, polls open from 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. And his byword was, the people, not the bosses, should rule. Well, he was elected the mayor of Boston. The first thing he did was to move to Boston. He was living in Acton, Massachusetts, though he ran for the mayoralship of the city. And in that instance, he moved to a place that would eventually be called Ashmont Hill. But one of his campaign speeches would always end with a rendition of Sweet Adeline. And it was, "You're the flower of my heart." I don't know how well he sang or not, but this was something that had a ballad and refrain that not only he would sing, but it seemed like everybody else would sing. These were more than just political jobs. They were things that basically offered hope for these people. And in that instance, all they asked for was your vote. And the vote was an important feature. He moved to Dorchester, He moved to Dorchester's Ashmont Hill. This house was on Wells Avenue, built in 1872. It was enormous, 12 rooms. He had a large family. Today, though it's no longer standing, 5 houses were built on the site. So you realize in some instances that he and his family aspired to the American dream. Curley, his wife Mary Hannah Fitzgerald, his wife Mary Hannah Fitzgerald, and their children are seen in the library of the house. And in that way, he was not only aspiring to the aspects of what Boston represented, a well-earned education, but he would send his daughters to Blumenthal in Belgium. They were actually well educated, and his sons, of course, to Boston College. In this instance, Fitzgerald was the ideal candidate, and he represented Boston fairly well. But the whole aspect was, his daughter Rose was somebody in some ways that would actually represent the ideal, the Rose of Boston. And seen here on her wedding day to Joseph Kennedy, who would later become an ambassador of the court of St. James, it was the ideal union between two families who were basically second-generation Bostonians. And in this instance, these two people themselves would be going on, in some ways, to become one of the well-known families in the United States. But the whole aspect was her husband not only was educated at the Boston Latin School, but he was graduated from Harvard University. In that way, he was following in the footsteps of Brahmins. And in this way, with a well-earned education, he became the president of the Columbia Trust Company. It was located in Maverick Square in East Boston. It was not only a capital of over $10 million at the turn of the century, but he would parlay that into something that would actually be millions. He was somebody in a lot of ways that was well respected, and he did see his family continue to move up the social ladder. Seen here, he would actually become the ambassador to the court of St. James, something that represented the United States in England. And ironically, he was a Roman Catholic. It had never happened before. But he was somewhat of a protege of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who thought he might be a good addition to the ambassadorial position. The unfortunate thing was, he continually crowed that Western Europe was going to fall to Hitler, and he was recalled. But during that period of time, this was a man who began, in this instance, to have a great voice. And his family, in this instance, were people that by the 1940s and 1950s seemed to be in every newspaper, every magazine. And the whole idea here was, not only did we see the ambassador on the left-hand side, JFK on the center, and of course his grandfather, Honey Fitz, on the right, but they were the ideal aspect of the immigrant family who had assimilated through education. Well, in this instance, many of these people themselves realized that the triumvirate seen here had Honey Fitz, John Fitzgerald on the left, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy standing, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy seated. Joseph Kennedy wanted one of his sons to become the first Roman Catholic president of the United States. And when his first son was killed in action during World War II, the burden fell to his son. And he did actually run for politics. In that instance, after the World War II, we realized that PT 108 had been, 107, had been a good example of something that made his name quite well known. But seeing here, he would cast his ballot to become a member of the House of Representatives with his grandmother, Mary Hammond Fitzgerald, on the left, and his grandfather, Honey Fitz, on the right. Notice everybody has a ballot in their hands. I wonder who they voted for. Well, in that instance, you realize that JFK was somebody who would eventually move up to the United States Senate and eventually would run to become president. And seen here in a photograph, the day after his election to the presidency, they were photographed at the cottage at Hyannisport. On the left is Ambassador Kennedy, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, and of course JFK with his wife. Jacqueline Bouvier was somebody who was the perfect choice for an Irish Roman Catholic politician. She too was Roman Catholic, and though she purported herself to be French with the name Bouvier, she was actually half Irish, a quarter French and a quarter English. But she was in the social register, and she basically provided all of the panache because she could speak French, Italian, and Spanish. In that way, she was the perfect first lady. But the whole idea was they weren't the only, quote, royal Irish family in Boston. Seen on the right-hand side is James Michael Curley, a man who actually took to politics as quickly as did Honey Fitz. This is a photograph from about 1915, and we realize as Honey Fitz's ascendancy actually declined, actually James Michael Curley's ascended. They were two politicians that hated each other. They were probably more alike than they realized. But during the early part of the 19th century, with a population by 1900 in Boston of 750,000 people, at least 400,000 had some Irish descent. And in a lot of ways, James Michael Curley, seen here, was educated in the Roxbury schools for the Boston public school system. He himself only attained the 9th grade. But he was eloquent, because not only was he well-spoken, but he could actually do orations that had people listening to everything he did. He was personable, but he also became the mayor of the poor. And during the period of the 1930s and 1940s, we realized in some ways that the placards, when he was being re-elected mayor term after term, would show that he was the mayor of the poor, that humane experienced leadership would actually be provided if you elected James Michael Curley. In this instance, he was somebody who was a ward boss 100 times better. He was somebody in a lot of ways that when he was elected by people that put him into office because he might be able to represent them. They might also just owe him one thing, their vote. Maybe they got a job. Maybe they actually helped in some ways to actually change Boston. But we realized that was also the fact that by the period of the 1940s, Curley was running to be the governor of Massachusetts. Now, this advertisement said that Curley for better business, for permanent jobs, for security, for young and old. Vote the entire ticket and ensure humane, intelligent action. Well, he was elected governor of the Commonwealth, and his second term, he was elected while he was serving time in the penitentiary. He had taken a civil service exam for a friend, and he was found out. And of course, he was put into prison. He said when he arrived at the State House to take up his term as governor, that he would do it again. That basically, what could one do but other than support a friend? Well, in some ways, it says he was capable and a courageous leader, but he was somewhat of a scoundrel. And here, of course, as governor, with this sign that was behind his desk, it said, Governor, Character, Courage, and Curley. He was somebody in a lot of ways that took from the rich and gave to the poor. He drained public trust funds in the city of Boston, especially for the historic burial grounds, and used it for his campaigns. During that period, if one thought that Honey Phipps had skimmed the till, Curley did it 10 times over. Of course, he lived in Jamaica Plain, and he had this house built on the Jamaica Way, in a neighborhood that was built up with very wealthy houses. In that instance, this was built in 1912, and it was something that was built by contractors who did it free of charge as a gift to the mayor. When a house was being demolished in Providence, Rhode Island, much of the paneling from the 18th century was brought to Jamaica Plain to panel the drawing room, library, and dining room. But it wasn't just something where his family would live, it was also to prove a point. Do you see the shutters? Each of the shutters were pierced with a shamrock. And in that instance, he said, I want people to know that I am the Irish-American mayor of the city of Boston, and that I have arrived. Well, this was something in some ways that was a costly undertaking, but it would be that he lived here on a salary of $5,000 a year. In a lot of ways, he was also a protege of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, seen on the right-hand side. And between the 1930s and early 1940s, Curley was somebody that worked with the president, and he was the eyes and ears in Boston for the president. In that instance, we realized that he was somebody who was a scoundrel, he was a rogue, but he did a lot of accomplishments. And in that way, we realized one of the biggest was to acquire a low license plate. Now, it is said that Nirvana has actually been proclaimed when people win the low license plate lottery. Of course, number 1 would be fine, but Dr. Tudor of Milton had that license plate. Well, when he became governor, he wanted a license plate, and he got number 5. And in this instance, he's winking at us with 4 fingers and a thumb directly above. Well, that license plate is still owned by his second wife's grandson. I go to a doctor in Quincy, and it's in a condominium parking lot next door. Of course, I'm fascinated with this, and one time somebody was actually in the car. I was even tempted to ask who it was until I found out. But the whole idea was the books that would actually come out in the 50s and 60s were such things as this. Photograph of Curley, I'd do it again. Just as he said when he took the civil service test for a friend. It says that the autobiography of one of the most impressive, influential, and irrepressible politicians of the 20th century America, James Michael Curley. But the whole idea was, even another book was actually done, and it was The Purple Shamrock. Deneen wrote this, and we see him with the purple shamrock, the Honorable James Michael Curley of Boston. Well, between Fitzgerald and Curley, we saw the gamut from the early part of the 20th century right through to the 1950s. And this was something that really had changed the city. One of the politicians that became quite well known was Dapper O'Neill. And seen here in his office, he's pointing to a photograph of James Michael Curley on his wall. Well, Dapper O'Neill was an old-time politician, typically of a ward boss, somewhat of a buffoon. But he was somebody in some ways that represented the Boston of the past. And Boston was changing. By the 1950s and 1960s, Boston had a diverse population of people, not just from Western Europe, but Middle Europe, as well as China and the Asian countries. In that instance, books started to be written. And of course, this is a book by, oh my God, James Michael Curley, that was written by Senate President William Bulger. This is a short biography with, of course, his personal reminiscences. Well, Bulger was something who not only had started off as a politician in South Boston, but would eventually, in this instance, become the president of the Senate. And seen here in a photograph in the 1990s, he was somebody who really brokered a tremendous amount of power politically. Remember, he was the good brother. His bad brother was Whitey Bulger, who actually took a different course, but was just as influential. But in this instance, we realized that this man who could actually speak Greek and Latin, and was actually quite a good orator, was somebody who not only echoed Curley, but even Fitzgerald. And we realized in that instance, by the 1970s and 1980s, that again, the Kennedy continued with Ted Kennedy, who only served basically 50 years in the United States Senate. And seen here with Ray Flynn, who was mayor of Boston, later ambassador to the Vatican, we realize in some ways that Boston seemed to be not only a good example of immigrants by the third and fourth generation now becoming influential people, but in some ways they were typical of the people who looked at these sheet musics as things that were typical of how they thought. Many people thought of home, which was Ireland. It might be 3 generations, 4 generations back. But seeing here, this was a flower from Irish soil, and it was words of music by Miles McCarthy. In this instance, it actually showed a man on the lower right-hand side, typical of the Irish costume of the 19th century, but he's actually looking back as he left Ireland. And of course, the statue in the center holds a shamrock. These were things that made people lament in some ways that they had left Ireland. Maybe they didn't realize what a wonderful life they had in the New World. But the whole aspect was that Boston in the 20th century began to realize that people like Curley were an important part of the city's political heritage. Seen here in the area just adjacent to Faneuil Hall, they would actually build 2 statues of James Michael Curley. One, he's seated with a cigar in his fingers on a bench, and the other, bless you, the other is standing in the foreground. He was such a big character that he needed 2 statues. And in this way, many people in Boston, when they come as tourists, don't quite remember, let alone understand, how politically influential he was. And during the period of the teens of the 21st century, we would see these statues being erected thanks to Tom Flatley of the Flatley Companies. They represented 2 statues that were placed in the small park directly across from the Old South Meeting House. And they were done to depict the Irish as they were suffering from the famine in the 1840s in Ireland, and of course, as they became Americans in 1940. In this instance, we realize that the Irish-American aspect is really no different than any other ethnic or religious group coming to the New World. As I mentioned, it could be starvation, it could be famine, political, religious, and all sorts of different things. But in this instance, especially during the month of March, the Irish in Boston, in some ways, are a great example of the resilience and the actual desire to actually contribute to the fabric of a city called Boston. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Does anyone have any questions or comments? I suppose it was political royalty.
I thought it was royalty.
Exactly.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
I wondered, I always thought, because of that bar that was right here, I thought about it.
No, they call the Purple Shamrock Bar after that Purple Shamrock from the book.
But purple meaning purple prose, like very, talking, eloquent.
I think Deneen really meant it was basically, he was the political royalty of the day, but it's interesting. I apologize too about the clicker, Deneen, it's a bit much. Any other questions or comments? Well, I do have a few books here. My latest book was on Inferno, which was on the Great Boston Fire of 1872. Many people don't even realize there was a fire that destroyed 65 acres of Boston between the Old South Meeting House and Filene's all the way to the ocean. And in that way, the book itself represented November of last year. But I also did another book, which most of my friends thought I was going to be run out of town. And it's called The Other Red Line. And it's from Scully Square to the combat zone. And there are some pretty interesting photographs. I'm sure none of us ever went to either place. But the whole idea is, in some ways, it's another example of adult entertainment in the city of Boston. We have to realize it's not just architecture and social development. We also have to realize there are lots of places of fun. They're all $20 cash or check, but I really appreciate everybody coming today. Thank you so much.